All right. Hi, everybody from around the state. I hope you're well.
Yeah,
Welcome on in. Hi, Joe. Good to see you. I can hear and see you. We'll
great.
get,
You can hear me? Perfect. Thanks.
yeah, thank you. All right. Welcome on in, everybody. Make yourself at home. I'm Angie Hacker. I'm the Statewide Best Practices Coordinator with the California Climate and Energy Collaborative here for our 39th meeting of LERN. We're still at it. So are you. I hope you're well, grittier than ever. I would love for y'all to introduce yourself over chat and feel free, because we're going to be shifting our focus a little bit more to some policy conversations as we have been. Share any particular energy or climate policy that you might be tracking in your neck of the woods to share with the group. All right, let's go ahead and dive in because we have such a meaty meeting today. We're going to save all the time we can for discussion. As always, we are here to help you access opportunities that can help you advance your local energy and climate goals. We're going to do what we normally do, which is run through an opportunity roundtable. We want to hear from you what you are aware of in terms of opportunities out there. And then we're going to hear from a lot of guest speakers today on the topic of energy affordability and the state's energy efficiency budget. And because it's a meaty topic and we have quite a few speakers, we might actually extend ourselves all the way through what we normally consider our bonus breakout into 12:15, just so we can leave time for lots of discussion. Okay? Okay, and as always, you don't have to stress about taking notes, or everything will be shared, the recording and all the materials. Okay, so as always, we like to go into our opportunity roundtable. This is the hyperlink cheat sheet that you all get access to, and then Rochelle and Kelsey will be dropping links in the chat for you to follow along as we talk through opportunities. But one of the shifts we've been doing in the recent LERN meetings has been to give a little bit more attention to policy matters that are leading to changes in the funding landscape. And so since there are so many changes to the local place-based funding landscape, we've just been trying to orient LERN a little bit sort of back in the anatomy of the origination of investments that later become a funding opportunity for you. And so that's why we're sort of shifting that focus to some of the things you're seeing on the left. On the left are a few of the items we're probably going to lift up in the next few meetings. So things like the executive order on energy affordability and its impacts on energy efficiency. And that's what we'll talk about today. In the future, we also should be looking at things like GGRF reauthorization, which affects the California climate investments. We'll look at a new piece of legislation, SB 584, Polluter Pay Climate Superfund Act, that was just recently proposed. We'll look at what's going on with the latest on the proposition for climate bond and changes that are happening in the proposed state budget. So stay tuned to that. But there are funding sources still, y'all. And so let's go through a couple of those before we get into our conversation. First one I wanted to highlight here is just, we're focusing a little bit more these days on philanthropic and state dollars. A philanthropic funding source, Climate Resilience Fund. It's called the Climate Smart Communities Initiative. We've talked about it before. Just wanted to let you know that they gave more time. So it's just been extended to March 21st, 2025. That link will be dropped in the chat. Hopefully you're already on it if you're planning to apply. Then there's this new one that has come out from GoBiz, so that's Governor's Office. It's on the California Regional Investment Initiative, implementation phase 1. It looks like pre-applications will be due March 26th, a notice of intent, for a notice of intent. And then April 23rd will be the due date for a pre-application. Full applications won't be due until March 28th, but still pretty quick timeline turnaround. Total funding here for the entire state is $125 million. It's general fund funded. The minimum award would be $500,000. There is not a maximum. Eligibility will be most of you, so nonprofits and other community-based organizations, institutes for higher education, local governments, special districts, MPOs, for-profit entities are not eligible to apply. But the purpose of this one is a two-phase competition to select regional coalitions and their project clusters that advance sector growth in one or more regions, and to invest in highly competitive individual projects from within the cluster. This one's really around a combination of like climate and economic development related to the Jobs First program. So I wanted to make sure you were aware of this one. That one, again, pre-application would be due March 26th. Wanted to mention too, FEMA. Some of you that are doing climate resilience and adaptation sometimes look to a program called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, the BRIC program. That one had been live. It was going to be due April 18th, 2025. I'm raising this because the NOFA is actually missing and we're wondering if it's rescinded. Just letting you know, this one's a little bit uncertain right now, like a lot of things at the federal level. If anybody on the call has any intel, has learned anything more about this program, drop it in the chat. Honestly, wanted to mention a couple others. One from CAL FIRE. This one would be due on April 25th. It's a new one, Business and Workforce Development Grant. The purpose of it is to maintain and enhance the forest sector workforce and business of California to promote healthy, resilient forests through the state by supporting a diverse set of business development and workforce development projects. Local agencies are eligible. The grant awards range from $10,000 to $5 million, depending on the topic. So you could do business development, workforce development, or business research and development. I'm bringing it up because some of you have healthy soils initiatives or other kinds of wildfire efforts in your climate action plans as a emission reduction strategy, or you might be thinking about it from a resilience perspective. Another one here to take a look at might be from the California Energy Commission. This is the Rural Electric Vehicle Charging 2.0, Rev 2.0. There's actually a webinar happening on this one tomorrow, but the due date for the grant is May 23rd. The purpose of it is to fund projects that will install light-duty electric vehicles charging infrastructure in rural communities. Public and private entities are eligible for this one. There's a total of $10 million. For this one, projects are eligible for 80% of the total allowable project cost, or $4 million, whichever is less. And the last one I wanted to mention here is really more of an incentive. So this is coming from our friends at the Center for Sustainable Energy. It's a Fast Charge California Project 1. It would be due, due on July 8th, 2025, but this one's actually first come, first served, like a lot of incentives are. Purpose of this one is to provide incentives for the installation of high-power DC fast chargers at publicly accessible sites across California. And so you can get incentives of up to 100% of the project's total approved costs, capped at $100,000 per charging port. Okay, that was the fire hose that I wanted to share with you. There's a couple of input opportunities I wanted to get on your radar as well. Just two big events. The CCEC program is helping to participate in planning with LCI and the Strategic Growth Council. So it's kind of an extension of what we had been doing with regional convenings. There's one in San Diego coming on March 25th. We'll be at Viejas, and another one in Long Beach covering the greater LA area. These are called Catalyst convenings. The LA one will be on March 26th. I'm hoping one of my team members can drop the information for that in the chat. They are already filling up quick. So if you haven't signed up yet, you may end up on a waiting list, but we're excited about that conversation and doing more of what we do on state and local coordination. Okay, let's want to encourage folks in the chat, continue to raise anything up that you're aware of that we didn't cover. Let's help each other out and make sure we can all get access to the dollars that still remain. All right, so I only get to talk for another minute or so because I want to just ground set on this topic of the day. We have a really nice long list of really brilliant speakers who I'm very fortunate to be with today. And so just to sort of set this topic up, energy affordability and energy efficiency. I think none of us can ignore the issue of energy affordability these days in our communities. Most of you, I think, completely agree with state leaders that folks in your jurisdiction are looking for bill relief, particularly as higher electricity costs are making your decarbonization efforts within your jurisdiction even harder. So you may remember last year at the CCEC Forum in Palm Springs, we had all learned about some concerning legislation that was being just sort of at the beginning stages of being considered that was seeking to reduce the growing energy cost burden on consumers, but barking up kind of a bizarre tree to get there, the state's energy efficiency budget. So that's been funded by ratepayers through the public purpose charge for decades and is inarguably not the cause of rising bills. It's actually designed to help lower them. So there's been this kind of misguided narrative, not just here in California, but in states across the country with a public purpose charge that, you know, this public subsidy for energy and emission savings program should be targeted rather than the real drivers of cost increases, which we're going to get into. So there's been a lot of movement since, including a coalition that has had some success shifting the narrative here a little bit. And And then there's been an executive order that has prompted a bit of action, meaning we're seeing evaluations, regulatory proceedings, and hearings related to the energy efficiency budget. And those are occurring now. And so it's not lost on me that you all are really experiencing a lot of hard choices when it comes to your funding right now. So we're here to talk about what impacts all of this might be having on some of the funding that you have access to. We know that there's a huge loss of available funding right now happening nationwide, and may not be the best time to be thinking about fiddling with one of the state's only recurring sources to pay for place-based energy and emission reduction. So I've asked some friends here to share some expert and local updates on the issue, help us start thinking about what a more constructive approach to energy affordability might look like for our constituents. So with that, I am very excited to welcome up our first speaker. So I'm very happy to welcome up Joe Desmond. He's the Executive Director of the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. You might know them as CEDMIC. They've been an effective leader in this space and on this issue, and he's going to give us the latest updates on policies that are affecting energy efficiency. Thanks, Joe.
Great, thank you. I'm going to forward the next slide, please. Okay, I just wanted to start by, I know everybody knows this, but to take into account the fact that energy efficiency products deliver the same services while using less. The energy measures have benefits, but most important thing I wanted to start with reminding folks the investment in energy efficiency is meant to be to the maximum extent possible, and that is because it is the load legislation which puts energy efficiency first before utilities invest in other resources. So next slide, please. The challenge is that information is not really being addressed, as you heard from Angie, in a different way. So what I have put here is just the response, just a link to the CPUC response to the executive order, which talks about a lot of things. If you look at that diagram, you'll recognize that energy demand response and energy efficiency very, very small parts, and yet they have taken a very comprehensive position in the conversations that have been having just in the last couple of weeks. Next slide, please. Okay. What I wanted to, I've sat through and reviewed all of the presentations so far that we heard at the oversight hearing, and I just wanted to mention that, you know, historically these have always been supported. And you can see here the public purpose programs are characterized as something that is a large contribution to impacts. Next slide. What I wanted to highlight is that the Public Advocate's Office, which is part of the CPUC but independent, continues, I should say, to phase out ratepayer funding of programs that they deem are not cost effective. And the issue is that they have very different views as to what cost effective is and what it's not. They would like to sunset programs that don't provide safe, reliable services or do not deliver measurable energy savings. Next slide, please. So an example of this is their recent statements that there are already 200 programs as non-cost effective, and they want to eliminate those. They talk about these programs having to be cost effective, but ultimately there's a difference in how people are looking at this information and evaluating it. Next slide. So what they highlighted last year, and this was the slide from March 6, 2024, was what the sources are of drivers. And you can see one of the things that they really focused on was energy efficiency program budgets paid for by IOU customers. And what you see there is a partial list of non-cost effective programs, arguably the same 200 programs that they had talked about earlier this year. Next slide. The issue is that almost all of the programs are listed are non-cost effective. Let me make sure I have my time. Non-cost effective energy efficiency programs by the PAO. And they are not resource acquisition programs. I just wanted to let people understand that The cost effectiveness of programs is at the portfolio level. What they're talking about is looking at and applying certain tests at the program level. And when you do that, you take advantage of, well, you don't take advantage of anything. What you're doing is you're taking out or taking away all of the programs that actually support the efficiency programs. And so you can see an example of what this is: the EM&V evaluation, new program design, agricultural. It goes on and on and on. All of these are critical when it comes to making these programs work. Next slide, please. So you can also see the recommendations that they were providing internally to the, I want to say to the commissioners last year as to what they would like to see. They, talked about the currently authorized budgets, performance and costs in regional energy networks. But really, this you can see in the next slide what they think of that. And next slide, please. And so here is the communications that they are providing. This was in the fall of last year, looking at the total EE portfolio budget, where the IOU programs were split as cost-effective, non-cost-effective, and a percent of that budget, the CCAs, and you can see here, list RENs as 100% non-cost-effective without really doing anything. And that is provided to people who are not necessarily familiar with all those requirements. Next slide, please. So what do we have that's happening here? I just wanted to highlight a couple of recent studies that are beginning to yield meaningful insights. And this was done a year, almost November, 12 months, so it's about 14 months old. But this is the PUC's own funded research, I should say, that identifies income qualified programs. And you can see that if the programs are going to be successful, here were the recommendations: consistency in determining bill impacts across programs, the importance of leveraging remediation funding to expand program opportunities, the importance of targeting to the right customers, improved collaboration between programs to minimize customer communications and confusion, identifying appropriate metrics given the different goals across the programs, improving property owner engagement, single point of contact and coaching. These are all critical information. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to point here, because this is a separate report, and this report talks about how customers make decisions. And specifically, what they're saying here is that, contrary to what the program administrators and implementers mentioned during the interviews, that most customers track, in fact, 95% track primarily by reviewing their monthly energy bill, and that is what determines how they make things. And I say that only because the fixed income, the IFG, income graduated fixed charge, rely on the assumption that customers are somehow being able to look at that information and provide, rational decisions as how they would get things there. Okay, and next slide. That's it. What I would say is I have incorporated a list of other slides that you might find interesting as it relates specifically to the response by the CPUC.
All right, thanks, Joe. That was a good overview. We're going to get into some of those details more about the real drivers of the costs increasing and the effects of some of these policies, but that was a good starter point. We're going to move now to our next speaker, somebody that you all know, Chris Reed. He's the Sustainability Manager at the City of San Luis Obispo. He's the co-chair of Green Cities California. He is going to help us learn a little bit more about the impacts he's seeing and why we should be addressing bill relief and affordability for our constituents and what it means for local decarbonization goals. So thanks, Chris.
Yep, thanks, Angie, and good morning, everyone. Chris Reed, Sustainability Manager, City of San Luis Obispo. Given the short time, we'll just shorthand some big conversations and say decarbonization is incredibly hard, and it's also easy to abstract into engineering concepts, financial concepts. But it's just worth saying out loud that these projects and this work happens in real places with real people, and cities are really at the front line interactions of those interactions between those real people and real buildings. We started doing this rapid decarbonization work 6-7 years ago. The economics looked fine. We looked at a wide range of issues around technical adoption, feasibility of the equipment, around workforce education and development, et cetera. And cost of electricity was sort of an issue, but at the bottom of that issue. We had Firm Zero Home do an assessment on the economic benefits of decarbonization efforts and total cost to homeowners. And around that time in 2021, around 2021, a study showed that like a heat pump hot water heater was a good deal for people, a reasonable return on investment to just buy it directly. And we also know that most Americans don't have cash on hand and don't particularly have an interest in becoming technical experts in water heaters. And so we also looked at the sort of supportive systems around them, including regional energy installations, including regional energy networks, how our CCAs were supporting. And based on the financial projections when paired with solar and on the technical assistance and rebates that are provided by RENs, like we had an honest to goodness forecast that showed rapid transformational decarbonization of water heating, which is the major fossil fuel consumer in our community. And it was really exciting times because that meant that we were going to have a rapid growth in our workforce that was going to create head of household and high road jobs. It meant that we were going to be able to, in low income and moderate income households, support these installations and retain real wealth and value in those spaces that were otherwise being extracted. And so as we fast forward, and we are where we are now, these conditions obviously no longer exist. And the gap between electricity and natural gas is so high right now that most of any projections really need to be brought down. And even in our pilot projects, we're focusing on delivering on our equity commitments by focusing on very low income households. We're having to really strongly pivot because in many of the households that we are considering working with, we're quite sure that a decarbonization investment will result in ongoing bill increases, which would burden folks that are really at the borderline of housing security. So this is a really major issue for us. Fortunately, we still have the REN's technical assistance, both on the building counter side and on the community side, to make sure that for our moderate and upper income community members that want to participate, that's still an option, but really major challenge for us in achieving our goal. And because California cities are the hotbed of innovation, we're not just sitting around and admiring this problem. In my role as co-chair of Green Cities California, I've been listening a lot to our membership, which is a peer learning network of about 27 cities and counties, and I've really seen this issue emerge as a top concern. And ourselves, along with other groups of cities like LGSCC, are coming together to really assess how we can leverage our collective power to influence these decisions. So we know this is a tough problem. Look forward to hearing the technical details from the other speakers. But if you are city staff and you are a member of those organizations or not a member of those organizations, either way, and you want to engage in sort of organizing around addressing this issue from a city perspective, please reach out to me via email. I'd be happy to patch you into that. Because this is no longer hypothetical. The benefits we are seeing in decarbonization are really under existential threat. And so it's time to stand up and make sure we can change those conditions so we can serve our communities better. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So an important issue for a lot of us working on decarbonization to address energy affordability. And we want to do it in a way that's meaningful and constructive and effective, right? So I'm going to introduce up our next speaker. Excited to welcome up Mark Costa. He's going to help us get into this even more about the drivers of these cost increases, the need to better define affordability, and then just a perspective coming from the local government Sustainable Energy Coalition. And so if we can go ahead and get the slides back up, I want to introduce us to Mark Costa. A lot of you know him. He's the Director of Policy and Planning at the Energy Coalition and a member of the LGSCC board. So thanks for being with us today, Mark. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's no simple answer, Angie, to the question about, what's really driving rates. And, folks may have been on different, webinars, may have heard Joe speak in the past, have heard, conflicting arguments from the PUC and Cal Advocates. But I just want to remind people, this all really comes down to utility spend, right? I think I'd subscribe to some of the presentations from people like Richard McCann, who have pointed these things out in some of the oversight hearings that have happened recently. And that really requires a lot of attention, but at the same time, that's something that's largely been out of our group's wheelhouse, right? We've obviously focused on energy efficiency and programs and things relevant to running local governments. And this is a whole new world of capital infrastructure on the utility spend side. It's not so unfamiliar to local governments to run a city. And just compare and contrast those processes and procedures, right? Profit-seeking organizations like the investor-owned utilities, do you have the business incentive to be investing capital and making a return on that? And the utilities are authorized by the commission to recoup those funds. And there's a certain point where this transition that we're in with the energy sector and renewables, successful energy efficiency approaches a tipping point where that business model is somewhat threatened. And that really has largely been unaddressed. And it comes down to on the utility planning side, they call these things investment frameworks. And these investment frameworks are oriented towards utilities. They're not really oriented towards people in society. So I would really think that if the, not to question the intent, but that North Star that guides decision-making processes, if customers were truly at the center of that, we may not see the same decisions being made that have authorized these rate increases. So with that, I'll just go through a couple points that are adjacent to that. But as we heard from Joan, the first speaker, energy efficiency provides tremendous value, but it's under attack from multiple angles, both on the policy side, the legislature, regulation, governor's office, from all fronts. And one thing that we can do here, it's really important that we build this record, that we build a record with good studies, with good information and complete information, because we've all seen, and I wouldn't call them incorrect facts, they're just incomplete or misleading facts. That is the only thing that decision makers in the legislature have heard. In fact, a lot of folks in the position of power, energy is foreign to them, and they have to be experts or attempt to make very big decisions on topics across all of society, and energy is just one of them. Two things we should be looking at: the successor proceeding for energy efficiency. There's a few legislative bills that we'll be looking at, and a lot of them have to do with rate reform and CPUC governance. But we're starting to see these recurring themes across those about cost shifts on solar or bill impacts of energy programs. And we just saw this in Massachusetts with the Mass Saves program being decimated. And it's the same narrative that we're seeing here in California. So if that crumbled, it's an indicator of maybe a larger playbook that's out there. One of the things about the cost argument is that when we hear things at some of these oversight committee hearings, we're just hearing about the costs. And some of those slides that we saw earlier, they just show the costs. But the other side of the equation is there's benefits. And in fact, there's huge returns. So these things are investments. For every dollar that we put into energy efficiency, we get $8 back. That is not the same for the utility cost of capital. The returns are not nearly as good, yet we're still continuing to invest in those in the grid, and in fact, making a grid that's prohibitive for energy efficiency and electrification, just as Chris said. So there's just a couple more, points here. So, but with that holistic approach, I think we can make a pretty good argument that we should consider all these benefits that come with the cost and remind the commission that, you know, these are investments. We heard about the EPIC program, and that the I in EPIC is investment. So, I mean, this is what we need to look at. And these are immediate benefits. They're long-term benefits, like life cycle benefits, and they're just really not captured on the record. So we need to come out with that. The other thing to consider is that energy programs work as a system. There are just certain things that need to happen in order to have a successful portfolio. So if we don't have the workforce, which carries zero cost effectiveness in the evaluation construct that we have, how can you deploy even the successful programs? There are programs in addition to low-hanging fruit that ensure the entire market moves in the right direction, and to ignore that is somewhat short-sighted. Let's see, let me get through a couple of these last ones. But we need to make the point that we need to build this environment that the things are needed, urgent, and what makes California a leader. It doesn't really hurt that these things can be cemented in commission decisions, and they are. So we actually have to undo commission decisions to drive down these costs. I'll say that the energy prices, I think we've seen some white papers on the utility revenue requirement increases. So that's really what this comes down to. I mean, there's wildfire stuff there's out there. There's, you know, net metering. I mean, those are just, in some cases, costs, but it's writing checks to spend on grid infrastructure, both gas and electric. And on top of that, the ability for utilities to overspend that by 30% without any oversight, right? It's a procedural approval to overspend by 30%. So we get rid of that and it would make a big dent. I don't think your city council would appreciate you as a director of a department going to your council and saying, oops, I overspent by 30% on this, you know, $10 million infrastructure project. I mean, you just like you cannot do that, but we're doing that in the public space through the utilities with private corporations. So just to close it out, I would say that, you know, affordability really needs to be better defined and understand what that means, and understand what the levers are, and understand what the trajectory of rates are in conjunction with what's needed to actually have a participatory energy system. We need to invest in that. And that may make rates go up on the margin, but it will allow the ability for folks like in Chris's region to, you know, put on DERs and management systems that reduce their overall bills. So a complete transition in this is holistic, and it requires a whole new perspective on investment frameworks. So I'll leave it there and pass it on.
Thanks, Mark. I'll always say we're lucky to have you on the team here. And thanks for bringing up so many points. There's more to say here. I want to encourage folks to continue to drop questions in the chat. We're going to cover those once all of our speakers are done. So with that, I'm excited to welcome up our next speaker, Casey Daly. He serves as the Director of Energy and Environmental Programs at Western Riverside Council of Governments. He's going to talk to us a little bit more about why EE programs are important. So thanks for being here, Casey.
Awesome. Thanks, Angie. Good morning, everybody. Casey Daly, and it's great to be here. You know, this is some very interesting conversation that we're having right now, but I'll just go ahead and jump into things on these importance of local energy efficiency programs. I wanted to start by just kind of talking a little bit about EE, and you know, Joe mentioned it earlier in his slides, but the state adopted loading order places energy efficiency first. You know, the idea here, you make the building as efficient as possible before going into other solutions. And I like to say that the cheapest kilowatt is the one that we never use. Energy efficiency really is the cornerstone foundation to all of the state's decarbonization goals in my mind. You know, I think that's evident in some of the data that we have now. Over the decades, EE programs have saved California over $1 billion, reduced peak electricity demand by nearly 700 megawatts. It's enough to power 200,000 homes. 2023 alone, California's EE program generated about $5 billion in benefits to ratepayers. You heard Mark's comment about the every dollar invested sees an $8 return in avoided costs. And one of the ways that we're able to deliver these EE programs here in California now are through the regional energy networks, or RENs. You heard Chris mention a shout out to the RENs, so thank you. But back in 2013, the RENs began as pilot programs. And the idea here was to deliver energy retrofit solutions while offering education and outreach, workforce training, and other incentives localized and tailored to the specific region or community that were being served. And Bay REN and SoCal REN were the first two to pioneer this. And then over the years, Bay REN and SoCal REN have been joined by Tri-County REN, the IREN, which is ours, the Central California Rural REN, Northern Rural REN, and now the San Diego REN. So collectively now, RENs collectively serve about 94% of the state's population. Our focus really is to serve those hard to reach communities, really get into programs and filling gaps that are left by the IOUs. Energy efficiency really is the most cost-effective way to reduce electricity bills. We offer a holistic approach that helps to ensure that nobody is left behind. A couple other points here. I've seen it in the chat here a little bit regarding the term cost effectiveness. And I agree that the term cost effectiveness is a bit misleading when we're talking about particular and specific programs. Here in the Inland Empire, where IREN serves, our programs are focused on public sector, helping to support our local governments and build capacity, reduce their energy consumption in their buildings. We have a workforce program that has a fellowship component where we're able to place recent grads into local government so that they can work on those energy efficiency programs. We were setting up institutional partnerships across the region with our workforce development boards to leverage their dollars so that we can help further build capacity in the region to help support the overall energy transition. And so, I think all of these things wouldn't be done but for the ability to use EE resources. And I think the last thing I want to say, and there's a ton more that I would like to say, but in my mind, it is very appropriate for EE programs to stay as they are. Currently, we're funded through the public purpose program charge, which is about 1.5% of a customer's bill. That number hasn't grown in recent decades, yet the effectiveness of what we're doing, the delivery of services, is only getting better. And as we look at what's going on around the state with the affordability issues, I think it's really important that we make sure that energy efficiency, capital E, stays as a ratepayer funded program. And I think, and the last thing I'll say is I know that we've got a new proceeding that's going to be opening up. A couple folks have mentioned that. And I think that really is the time for us to have those conversations around what does the term cost effectiveness mean? And is there a more appropriate term or is there a more appropriate measure that we can look at to better illustrate the effectiveness of these EE programs beyond just the dollars and cents that was established previously. So I'm happy to talk more, answer any questions, but I would like to pause now and turn it back to Angie.
Thanks, Casey, and thanks for your leadership. So many moving parts and pieces, guys, and so many ways to consider how to address this meaningfully. So thanks for raising some of that, Casey. We're gonna go to our next speaker. We've got 2 more speakers, and we're gonna go to questions. Like I said, if you arrived late, this one's running all the way through 12:15, so stick around for overtime. I'm really pleased to welcome up another speaker representing a REN. So Steve Frisch, he is the president of Sierra Business Council and also with Northern Rural REN Rural Energy Network. So thanks for being here, Steve.
Great, thanks, Angie. So I just wanted to give people a little bit of an update on legislative outreach and what we've been hearing while we've been doing legislative outreach. So far we've conducted about 25 meetings with targeted legislators, obviously targeting the utilities committees, but also others. And we've been basing our kind of education campaign with them on a set of talking points that was put together by CalREN, the state organization of RENs, that highlights some very specific points. So, number one, the point that RENs support transparency and affordability and want to be a partner in solving the problem. Number two, that energy efficiency really is not the cause of utility rate inflation over the past 10 years. And indeed, it's the most cost-effective way to reduce costs, with that $1 in investment leading to $8 in savings number that both Joe and Casey, I think, or Mark referenced, right? Another point we've been making is that RENs target benefits to hard to reach and disadvantaged communities, and as unique entities focused on not duplicating utility energy efficiency programs, but going beyond them, that they're uniquely positioned to affect the most at-need ratepayers. And the final point we've been making is that all of the analysis is showing that the largest drivers of utility rate increases have been wildfire resilience, net metering, legacy contracts, and grid modernization. And that the most rational way to look at cost containment would be to look at the largest drivers and try to create efficiencies in those large drivers of utility rate increases. The other thing we've been noticing in our meetings, by the way, is that most of the legislature and legislative staffers are very familiar with CCAs, but they're not very familiar with RENs. So the RENs really have not been present in the Capitol and doing meetings like this. And to the extent that they can ramp up their presence with their legislators, it would make a huge difference. The staff is very hungry for information. The legislators are hungry for information. And right now, really what they're seeing is information mostly from the utilities or from the CPUC and CEC reports. So we really need to do a better job of getting into the decision makers and making the case. But the one area that we've really been focusing on is wildfire resilience and the wildfire utility mitigation plans as a cost driver of utility rate increases. And if you look at those utility wildfire mitigation plans, it's really important to note that those plans target transmission lines as both sources of ignition and at risk from ignitions outside the utility corridors. And they really look at kind of how do you harden that infrastructure to be more resilient to wildfire. About 70% of the plans are focused on reducing the utility lines as ignition sources, but about 30% of the cost of those plans is looking at broader wildfire resilience strategies. In the north, that's largely landscape level forest management in order to reduce risk to the infrastructure. And in the south, it's ignition reduction in the surrounding community and WUI vegetation management. So as we've looked at this increase in wildfire risk, we are seeing a convergence of kind of two things occurring in California: increased wildfire risk and utility risk, leading to utility rate increases. And the case that we've been making is that essentially portions of this cost for wildfire resilience at the utilities could actually be borne by other budget sources and would be more appropriately borne by other budget sources. So California right now spends about $500 million per year on wildfire mitigation. We spend another $1.5 to $2 billion a year on wildfire suppression. But that $500 million per year we spend on wildfire mitigation treats about 700,000 acres of landscape across the state. But we know from outside research that includes the California Forest Management Task Force, the California Air Resources Board, the California Natural Resources Agency, Nature-Based Solutions Climate Targets, that we actually need to be treating more like 1.5 million to 2 million acres a year in order to get ahead of the wildfire risk in the state. So in essence, what we're doing right now is spending less than a third of the money, less than a third of the $3 to $5 billion a year we need to spend on wildfire resilience. And that if we could shift that burden essentially to other state budget centers, for example, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which only has a $2 million set aside for wildfire resilience, it would create a more favorable atmosphere for containing wildfire resilience costs at the utilities. And that would be a huge contribution to at least one of those main cost centers. And then the final point I want to make is that in these legislative outreach meetings, there have been a couple of really interesting issues coming up. One of them is the issue that I think was brought up in the chat, that in essence, there is a guaranteed rate of return for the IOUs, and that the 10.5% guaranteed rate of return may no longer be the best way to really manage what the shareholders in the privately owned IOUs are receiving as return on investment. And then the second issue that has come up in kind of an interesting way is that for the utilities, essentially wildfire resilience is a cost of operations. So it shows up on their balance sheet as a cost. Whereas utility line maintenance and hardening is an asset that shows up on their balance sheet as an asset. And that changes how the utilities see what their responsibility is for wildfire mitigation. And that in essence, we need to look at whether or not we need more of a balance towards essentially resilience and less of a balance towards hardening in certain areas where hardening is not the most cost-effective way to achieve the objective. So I would encourage all of you to meet with your legislators, bring them up to speed, share the SEDMEC resources and the CalREN resources, and begin to educate them because they're hungry for information and they're not getting enough. That's it.
Steve, you're amazing. Thank you so much. Such a good overview. Thanks for your leadership. We've got one last speaker, and then we're going to go to some Q&A. So please join me. You all know Patrick Welch. He is with San Diego Community Power. He's the legislative director. He's been very active in leading on this front. I'm going to tell you a little bit about an opportunity that you can participate in. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Angie, and pleased to be here. And for the group, San Diego Community Power is the second largest community choice aggregator in the state. We serve about 955,000 customers throughout the county of San Diego, providing clean and reliable energy. And later this year, in partnership with the county of San Diego, we will be launching the San Diego Regional Energy Network, which will be offering 10 different energy efficiency programs throughout the entire county. Great presentations by everyone. Wanted to bring it home by talking about some of the legislative advocacy that is going on within this affordability discussion. Likely later today, a letter with over 38 organizations will be going to the Senate Energy and Utilities and Communications Committee about the value of energy efficiency programs. There was a hearing last month on February 19th that committee held on affordability issues, and a number of stakeholders, including the Public Utilities Commission, PG&E, the California Large Energy Consumers Association, and then the Public Advocates Office, all kind of joined this chorus saying, we don't think that ratepayers should be paying for programs that don't have cost effectiveness scores. And some went so far as to say, we don't think customers should be paying for these programs at all. That whole public purpose charge, which funds many of these programs, should just be taken off customers' bill in the name of affordability. So this letter really responds to that criticism of energy efficiency programs and tries to lay out some facts for the Energy Committee. And it does that in several ways. One, it shows that energy efficiency programs are a small and declining portion of customer bills. 1.5% of a customer bill goes to this, and that's down from the year prior. And that's 800, and just for the group to know, $810 million last year out of $54 billion collected by the IOUs went to energy efficiency programs. Energy efficiency overall, the statewide portfolio is cost effective. There's different ways to measure that. It ranges from an ROI of $3 from every $1 to $8 for every $1. So clearly it is cost effective. It's critical for grid reliability. Many of these programs are designed to reach disadvantaged customers, and we need reliable, sustainable funding for these programs to be successful. So the first iteration of that letter is going to be going out today, most likely. It's going to be a rolling logo situation, so there will be additional opportunities to sign on, and I can work with Angie to get the letter out to this group. We'd love to have more on there, and we anticipate, at least for San Diego Community Power, we will be sharing that letter with our legislative delegation and then be working with other partners in the legislature to continue to advocate and communicate about the value of energy efficiency, so it doesn't continue to have this kind of negative slant on it from a number of stakeholders that are prominent in the legislative discussion. So that's it. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you, Patrick. If you have a link to drop in the chat, please feel free to do it. I'm happy to work with you afterwards. I want to say everybody here gets 2 brownies because you all really stuck to the time limits. Thank you so much. That was a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I'm going to ask the speakers if they want a second to kind of respond to each other, but first I'm going to tackle a couple of the questions in the chat. Okay, so one of the there's a whole discussion happening in the chat among some very smart people about cost effectiveness, and I think some of it's been addressed by the speakers, but I wondered if Tessa wanted to just unmute and kind of raise up some of the discussion that's happening here in the chat, which is constructive.
Sure. Hi, Tessa Charnovsky, SoCal REN. Joe mentioned that there are 200 programs that are considered non-cost effective, and that the majority of programs that the RENs provide, I think I heard you say, are non-cost effective, which makes no sense because we do achieve energy savings on most of our programs, and then the ones that don't are absolutely essential: workforce development and evaluation programming and a whole array of other programs. So it seems to me that the definition of cost effectiveness is wrong. It's false. And we should get the 200 number down to 3 or something. And so how do we do that? How do we convince legislators, CPUC, commissioners to understand that because the word non-cost effective sounds terrible. Like, who wants to have non-cost effective programs? So to me, the definition is key. And that's what the issue I rose.
Right. Calling things cost effective is an arcane definition and not necessarily a correct statement, a layman statement. Okay, thank you, Tessa. And I see some other comments in the chat, like how do we talk about this? These are complex issues. How do we talk about this in a way that we can talk to policymakers in ways that work? So happy to hear more folks talking about that over the chat. I do want to address another question that popped up here. Joe, you've been handling it a little bit in the chat, but I want to give you another opportunity out loud to say more about how CEDMIC is sort of leading on pushing back or advocating, defending the public purpose charge. You've been at this quite a bit. What are you up to? What's the latest?
Thank you. There's a lot that's going on. Obviously, we first dealt with this issue last year when there was following the very first, I don't say the very first, but the same presentation that was given by Public Advocate's Office on March 6, 2024. The reason I included some of those images is the way in which that is being framed. They didn't give you the opportunity to actually read what was there. In other words, it just was a microscope of projects, and the thing they want you to listen to and focus on is simply the statement. This is just tip of the iceberg, sort of terrible situation that they have. And they actually, in their comments, went so far as to say, when asked by the chair, on the oversight, Petrie Norris, they actually said, well, actually, none of them are worth, they're cost effective. And they even argued, that there was potentially even questions around codes and standards. Be that as it may, it is the positioning of information. You really have to dig fast. And I just wanted to, here's how we were successful in delivering that message. First thing is energy efficiency. We talked about the loading order is clearly what people have to do first. And in the IPRA, which is the Integrated Energy Policy Report that all the agencies contribute to, and then the PUC, the Energy Commission publishes that. That baked in there is a forecast, and that forecast includes assumptions on how much energy efficiency we're going to get. And that then makes the other information says, okay, and what's the balance that we have to do? What it says is really means is if you eliminate the energy efficiency, you're guaranteeing higher bills because there are only more expensive resources that would take its place. So that's a real important point. The other is when people say, well, codes and standards, they are, they carry the weight. Well, you can't have codes and standards until you've gone through all of the process. And by the way, the CEC is required to have, legal analysis that demonstrates, but that occurs over time. And then when you get these new standards, if you eliminated it, you would not be moving forward with new standards, arguably. So there's a lot of things. And I want to just say there's a very complicated way. The PUC has a document, but the TRC, the total resource cost, that it actually incorporates customer cost. So like you heard early on, if you have you're thinking about buying a heat pump and it's a $7,000 rebate, and I'm going to spend $20,000 of my own money because I want to upgrade my house, and that TRC counts the $20,000 as a cost. And it's not. And so something is called the PAC test, but I use the language, it's better, I think the better way to say is it's the ratepayer cost effectiveness test, because that fundamentally is that $1 for the $8 return on investment there. So I see Peter has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Sure.
So, a lot of action happening. And CEDMIC, I want to just say thanks to CEDMIC. CEDMIC's been a real leader on this issue. They're in position to do it. Your friends here at SEEK, we do information sharing only, but some of you have different positionality. All right, let's go to Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Angie. Peter Wells with the County of San Diego. I'm just curious, just on a strategic level from all of you, what we've seen in the past here in San Diego is that SDG&E is trying to walk away from all of their existing energy efficiency programs, and submitting that formally with requests through the PUC. But I'm curious, like at a state level, are you all strategically seeing alignments in IOU lobbying around a kind of general walk back from energy efficiency and campaigning against it? And I'm curious, particularly because do you see any alignments in a sort of a logic against it being that it's about cost savings and more about retaining bottom line or improving profits? Or do you think there's something in this around retaining market capture that would otherwise be over time more and more supplanted, as a couple of people have mentioned earlier, by greater adoption of DERs and down the road the virtual power plant rollouts?
That's a really good question. Would love for any of our speakers to try to tackle that one. Just
Yeah, I can say a few words, Peter. I think PG&E and San Diego Gas and Electric have been very clear that they at least don't think ratepayers should be paying for these programs. Edison hasn't been, in my observation, as vocal, and I think they have, a unique situation in particular this year, given the wildfires down south and what they're contending with. So I would say at the very least there is near alignment in it from what I've seen in the Sacramento discussions. And just my personal observation is it's more about there's a movement among, and this is kind of national too, is among IOUs, is really to streamline their core business to focus on infrastructure, because that's where, right, that's the core business. And so you look at other things like energy efficiency, customer programs, billing services, those are just pass-through costs. And so I think there's just a general movement to looking at, what are the actual deliverable results for the IOUs, and those are their infrastructure where there's a return on equity.
Thank you, Patrick, for addressing that one. Does any of the other speakers want to chime in? It's hard to follow Patrick sometimes. He always nails it.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I'll pretty much agree with that. I mean, even when you see things in the LA Times from folks like Sammy Roth that, point to these, coordinated efforts across the utilities, not just California-wide, but, nationwide, in terms of, playbooks and narratives on these. It's hard to think that there's, not a coordinated effort around this. But just in the case of SDG&E, I mean, one of the things is that it's energy efficiency for resource programs and for measures and all the calculations that need to go in it is just so complicated, and not just from the customer standpoint, but from the administrator standpoint, that, folks on the CalTF, the California Technical Forum, were really trying to change that. I mean, there was even legislation a few years back to simplify the process. So if it's such a small part of SDG&E's operations that it's just become so unwieldy that delivering energy efficiencies, in their opinion, not something they want to engage in, there's something more systematically wrong around that. So that's, an answer specific to the energy programs.
Okay, thanks so much. I want to go back to our full speaker panel and invite anybody who would like to sort of chime in on what they heard from the other speakers. Is there anything you want to add or just emphasize that you heard from each other? And maybe Chris, I know you got to go soon. If you have anything to share, you can go first.
I appreciate the technical expertise our speakers brought to the conversation, and I think really we'll look to them as beacons for sort of what the optimal solution is, and look to our peer cities to organize and figure out how we can influence these conversations moving forward.
Well, thanks to GCC and all the work you all are doing there to try to tackle this impact on building decarbonization. Any other speaker want to address each other?
Sure. I've been waiting to get a hold of Steve Frisch. He's just been too busy lately, and want to highlight that what he's talking about here is, there's all this attention to talk about affordability, and it's such a small part. What are you missing? What Steve is highlighting what those things could be done differently. In fact, there was another hearing with the it's always a little Hoover little Hoover Coke. What is it?
Commission, I think.
Thank
Yeah.
you. The condition. And so you got to hear different perspectives. I wanted to say that was he first speaker, Severin Bornstein, probably spoke to an hour, and I was surprised at how well the questions were asked. But just it's an example of the differences between how people are. In that case, he highlighted, or he has since highlighted, that the PAO's their claim that the cost shift is $8.5 billion a year. Severin says it's half that. And then you've got other people saying, no, it's not. I'm not here to justify that, but there's a huge amount, and people have to really dig deep into understanding what these are. And so, the focus here on, little pennies and the dollars take care of themselves, that's not it. There's a lot. I want to say Matt Friedman from turn highlighted all the potential benefits of public funding of some of these programs, to save money. And then when you listen to certain, comments, the comments oftentimes are answers that actually aren't exactly what they throw you to a different direction. And I see that, not all the time, but, I people answering questions, but saying, but that's not the relevant question answer. So, you have to be knowledgeable about this. And the other challenge too, and again, that's why I want to catch up with Steve very soon, is that the people in the legislature really don't understand this completely. They're not experts. And so when we go in and talk, we need to have it easy to understand, analogies, make it simple, because then they say, oh, why didn't they say that? So that the characterization of how you communicate is critical for people who are not experts and don't think about this day in and day out. So that's one thing I would recommend to anyone, is to keep that in mind, particularly homeowners. Nobody knows, and that's why I gave that example of that. But I appreciated what Steve had to say, and look forward to following up.
Thank you, Joe. And I
Joe,
think a
do
lot
you
of
mean that people are answering questions that they're not asked because they don't want to answer the question they were asked? I've never heard of that ever in my life.
But I think there is one other interesting thing that is beginning to emerge in this discussion, which is, to what extent should there be public financing of certain elements of our utility infrastructure, particularly transmission lines and hardening existing transmission lines, right? So, like, in order to really contain costs, you're going to have to look at each one of those large cost areas and come up with a strategy to reduce those costs by $1, $2, $3 billion a year each to get to the goal that they're looking at, right? And public financing of grid modernization could be one of those places, because because of the utility return on equity requirement, the cost of financing through the IOUs is way more expensive than it would be if it was publicly financed. And over a 50-year period, that's a lot of money, right? So that's one area. Wildfire resilience is another area, right? We need to find 2 to 3 areas as alternatives, so they don't come after our paltry $800 million a year.
Yeah, and it's probably even less than that. But Steve, you bring up a good point about these solutions. So if we put our finger, and I think it's clear as day, utility capital spend is the problem by and large. There's no denying that. But that message has just been so clouded, right? Because, as I think, has been said, the only people in the ear of these decision makers are overwhelmingly, by number and by funding, utilities and their allies.
Yeah.
So focusing on those things, on where we can make a difference, is really interesting. I mean, it's such an array of things that people have talked about. Municipalization, right? San Francisco's going through that. San Diego kind of went through that with the franchise agreement a while ago. It's really interesting to think about that, but it's really important to get a little bit more of a grasp of what comes with that, or what options could come with that. And a good thing that I point to is the state of Maine. And they had a DSO study, distribution system operator study, that really said, well, what does the grid do, right? If the grid's costing us all this money, what does it do? And what are the roles around that? And there's this system planning part. Joe, you mentioned there's this IPER.
Yeah.
At the CEC, that's the apex document that guides a lot of this. And then that flows over into the Energy Committee, to the CPUC for the integrated resource plans and distribution resource plans. That's where all the money goes. And that goes to the general rate cases, where they approve those expenditures that have been planned in a vacuum chamber by the utilities, given these wonky cost-effective rules that disadvantage all the solutions that include energy efficiency. So it's important to see what we can do there. Should the utilities no longer be in charge of, and this has been an analogy used before, Should you let oil companies be in charge of saying where they want to drill? Right? Probably not. Should you let profit-seeking utilities be in charge of saying how much and where, how much money is needed and where and when? Probably not. So if you start taking these into more of a public sphere of a responsibility, right? Not just the public process through the proceedings, but in terms of areas of responsibility of that system, while maintaining the security and expertise that goes with the existing utilities who, right, they have that expertise and it's really important. How can you remove the drivers, not just financially, but from a organizational standpoint? So that's really something that we need to get solutions around.
I just want to say I love seeing locals leading here. That clearly we've got to address energy affordability in this state. Clearly we need to educate our policymakers so that they understand, the impacts here with the less singular focus on just cutting EE. You can see that there's a lot of thinking already about constructive opportunities to act. I'm interested in your thoughts on sort of the backdrop here of what's going on in the federal environment. It's happening at the same time. Obviously, there's a relationship here. The executive order itself suggested we could shift program costs to federal funding, which only a week later the elections happened, and that was a silly proposition. We're all feeling that a lot right now. And in the meantime, we're seeing this, what could be a real hit to existing recurring funding sources. So I just want anybody to comment in on this sort of overall policy, that anything to save a buck is good policy. Anybody want to chime in on that?
Angie, I don't have anything necessarily to comment on about the changing administration, but again, going back to my thoughts around energy efficiency is kind of the cornerstone foundation. Energy efficiency doesn't need to be political. We're not in a space of forging ground or things along those lines. Particularly with the REN communities focus on hard to reach and disadvantaged communities. Energy efficiency is kind of like the social safety net of the energy world in my mind. And we've been, EE's been around for a long time, and it needs to continue to be around because all of these changing tides and currents and flows doesn't change at the end of the day. We all live in buildings, and those buildings consume energy, and we have to pay for that energy. And so, that fundamental thing is not going to change from one political administration to another. So those are my nickels worth of thoughts.
Well,
Last chance for one last comment.
Okay, I'll throw one out. I was surprised, utilities have the opportunity to verify their self-certify, I should say, for certain things, not lines and plants or the system, but extension, expansion, upgrades, and other modifications of electrical transmission facility. Historically, or at least up until, and I didn't realize this, there was a requirement that existing law requires the commissioners in considering an application for a certificate of public convenience and necessity, that the existing law requires the commission, to consider cost-effective alternatives to transmission facilities that meet the need for an efficient, reliable, and affordable supply of electricity, including demand-side alternatives such as EE, ultra-clean distribution, I would say all the other DER. Why am I saying that? That was repealed last year. There's no more requirement to do that. And I was not aware of that until I just happened to come across it today.
Wow.
Thank you, Joe. All right, everybody.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. It's 12:15. I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time. And I want to say thank you. Everybody say thank you to our speakers. What a great conversation. We are going to continue to have conversations like this where we're looking back a little bit into the anatomy of the origins of the policy making that is coming, that affects the funding opportunities that we all have and other things that y'all care about. So come back next month. We'll be at it again. And thanks again for everybody's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Angie, does your information